6 years ago, a healer knelt in the snow outside the gray keep and made a choice no mother should ever have to make. She let the man she loved believe their child had died. She let a king believe she had abandoned him. And she carried the truth away in her own arms, a newborn son with his father's storm-gray eyes, because a trusted voice had sworn to her that staying would get the baby killed. She raised him far from the mountains, in a river village where no one knew that a king's blood ran in a small boy who liked to sit at the edge of the woods and talk to wolves as if they were listening. And then, one gray morning, the boy let go of her hand in a crowded market, followed a pull he could not name all the way up the mountain road, and walked through the tall doors of his father's court as though he had always belonged there. The whole hall went silent. The Alpha King rose from his throne and looked at a child he had never met, and something in his chest that had been dead for 6 long years turned over and drew a slow, aching breath. Neither of them knew yet that the man who had torn their family apart was standing 3 steps from the throne, wearing the face of a loyal servant, already deciding how the boy would have to die. This is the story of how she came back, and of how this time she did not run. Chapter 1. The first thing Nerys understood was that Bram's hand was no longer in hers. One breath, his small fingers had been curled warm around her thumb while she counted coins for winter thread. The next breath, there was only cold air and the crush of market bodies, and a gap where her son had been. She did not scream. Screaming wastes time, and a healer learns early that the loudest sound in a crisis is almost never the useful one. She turned in a slow, hard circle, reading the crowd the way she read a fever, looking for the pattern that did not fit. There, a flash of chestnut hair between 2 grain carts, moving with purpose, moving up. "Bram," she called, and pushed after him. He did not stop. He never did when the pull took him. He had been like this since he could walk, drawn to tree lines and running water, and worst of all, to the great northern road that climbed out of the valley toward the mountains she had spent 6 years teaching herself not to think about. She caught the edge of his coat once near the fountain and lost it again when a mule balked and a wall of shoulders closed the lane. By the time she broke free, he was already through the outer gate, already onto the road, a small, determined shape trotting up the switchbacks with the gray stone hold rising above him like a thundercloud that had decided to become a castle. Nerys stopped for one heartbeat at the foot of that road, and the whole cost of the last 6 years pressed down on her chest at once. She knew this road. She had walked down it in the dark with a day-old baby against her ribs, telling herself with every step that she was saving him. She had sworn on that walk that she would never come back. That was the one promise she had made to herself, and it was the one she had believed she could keep. Her son was already halfway to the gate. "Bram, please," she whispered, and ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her healer's satchel beat against her hip. She ran past guards who called out and reached for her and missed. She ran through the outer bailey and up the worn steps and toward the tall doors of the great hall, which stood open to the morning, and she got there just one breath too late to stop what was already happening. Bram had walked into the court of the Alpha King. He stood in the center of the long hall, small and solemn in his travel-worn coat, his chin lifted the way it always was when he had decided something. Around him, the court had frozen. Nobles and warriors and servants, every one of them a wolf under the skin, stood as still as a forest before a storm, because their king had risen. And their king was looking at the boy as if the floor had opened under his throne. Nerys knew that face. She had spent one impossible winter learning it, every line and shadow of it, and then 6 years trying to forget it. King Alaric of the Grey Vale, tall and dark and terribly still, the most powerful wolf in the mountains, the man whose voice could quiet a war council with a single word. He came down from the dais one slow step at a time, and the whole pack seemed to hold its breath with him. He crossed the stone floor and stopped an arm's length from the child, and he looked down into a small upturned face that had his own storm-gray eyes staring back out of it. "What is your name?" the king asked. His voice was very low. "Bram," said her son, entirely unafraid. "Are you the Wolf King? I could feel you from the road." Somewhere along the wall, someone dropped a cup, and the sound of it rang out and died. The king went down on one knee in front of the boy, slowly, the way a mountain might decide to kneel. Nerys watched a tremor move through the whole hall as it happened, a shiver in the air, the pack feeling something in their alpha that they had no words for. She felt it too, standing in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth. She felt it the way you feel a change in the weather in an old wound. Then the king lifted his head, and his eyes went past his son and found her. For a long moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the length of the great hall, the healer in the doorway and the king on his knees. And 6 years of silence stood up between them and had nothing at all to say. "Nerys," Alaric said. Her name in his mouth undid something in her that she had spent a very long time trying to keep tied shut. And then, from the shadow of the dais, a smooth and gentle voice spoke, the voice of a man who had spent years being trusted. "My king," said the king's warden, stepping forward with his hands open and his face full of kind concern. "Let me take the woman and the child somewhere quiet. This is not a thing to be witnessed by the whole court." Nerys looked at the man who had spoken, at the silver at his temples and the calm in his eyes, and for one confused instant she thought only that he seemed familiar and kind and helpful. She did not yet remember where she had seen that face before. Chapter 2. They put her and Bram in a warm room high in the keep, with a fire and food and a guard at the door who was very polite and very immovable, and then they left her to wait. Waiting was the hardest thing. Nerys had built a whole life out of doing, out of setting bones and brewing fever teas and standing between sick people in the dark. Sitting still in this stone room, in this place, with her son on the rug in front of the hearth, eating bread and honey as if nothing at all had happened, was almost more than she could bear. "You are not in trouble," she told him, mostly to have something to say. "I know," said Bram, licking honey off his thumb. The Wolf King was sad, not angry. His wolf was very loud. He frowned at the fire. "Why was he so sad, Mama?" Nerys did not answer, because the honest answer was a thing she had been carrying alone for 6 years, and she did not yet know how to set it down. Here is the truth she carried. She had come to the Grey Keep as a girl, a healer's daughter from the river village of Thornwell, brought up the mountain because the old herb woman of the keep, a sharp and kindly soul named Marin, had needed young hands and a good nose for medicine. Nerys had never meant to catch the eye of a king. Low-born healers do not, in the ordinary run of the world. But Alaric had been young then, too, only 2 winters into his crown, still raw from the death of his hard father, and he had come to the still room one night with a wound he did not want the pack physicians to see. A wound taken protecting a shepherd's family from a rock slide, because the alpha of the Grey Vale did not like to be seen bleeding. Nerys had stitched it without asking his leave, scolded him for waiting so long, and told him plainly that a king who let himself die of stubbornness was no use to anyone. He had laughed. She had not expected him to laugh. After that, he came back, not every night, but often, on the excuse of small hurts, and then on no excuse at all, and they talked in the low golden light of the still room about things kings do not usually get to talk about: loneliness, fear, the weight of a whole people's survival resting on one set of shoulders. She had watched the guarded thing in him ease, one careful visit at a time, until the coldest man in the mountains would sit on her work table at midnight and let her see the whole of him. She had loved him. That was the plain, dangerous fact of it. And, against every rule of the world she had been born into, he had loved her back. They both knew what the pack would say. A king was meant to bind himself to a strong bloodline, a warrior born, an alpha's daughter, not to a village healer with dirt under her nails. So they had kept it quiet, and they had told themselves they would find the way and the words when the time was right. And they had been young enough and happy enough to believe there would be time. And then she had learned she was carrying his child, and then, before she could even find the courage to tell him, everything had fallen apart. "Mama," said Bram, tugging her sleeve, and she came back to the room and the fire and her son's gray eyes. "Someone is at the door." The door opened. It was not a guard, and it was not the warden. It was King Alaric himself, and he stood in the doorway of that small, warm room and filled it, and for a moment he did not seem able to come any farther in. He looked at Bram. He looked at Bram the way a starving man looks at the memory of a meal. "May I?" he said, and stopped. A king asking leave. Nerys had forgotten he could do that. "May I speak with him?" She should have said no. Every hard, protective instinct she had spent 6 years building told her to gather her son and put her body between him and this whole mountain of grief and power. But Bram had already stood up, brushing crumbs off his coat, studying the king with open interest. "You are very big," Bram informed him. The corner of the king's mouth moved, a small, helpless thing, as if he had not smiled in a long time and had forgotten the shape of it. "So I am told," Alaric said gravely. He came into the room and lowered himself to sit on the hearthstones, bringing his great height down to the boy's level, and Nerys understood that he was making himself smaller on purpose, the way you gentle yourself for a frightened animal. Bram was not frightened. Bram never was. He came and stood in front of the king and looked him over, head tilted. "You have my eyes," Bram said, in the tone of someone noticing that 2 stones matched. "Mama says my eyes come from my father. Are you my father?" The whole room went still. Nerys felt her heart stop and start again. For a long moment the king did not speak at all. When he did, his voice had gone rough at the edges, the way a strong thing sounds when it is holding on with everything it has. "Yes," Alaric said, "I believe I am." Bram nodded slowly, taking this in, filing it away with the same seriousness he gave to everything. Then he said, "You were sad because you did not know about me." "Yes," the king said again. "That is all right," said Bram kindly, and he stepped forward and put his small arms around the neck of the Alpha King of the Grey Vale, and the most powerful wolf in the mountains bowed his head over his son and shook, once, like a great tree in a wind. Nerys turned her face to the fire, because it was that or let them both see her weep, and she had cried enough tears over this man to fill the river she had raised his son beside. She had not planned for this. In 6 years of imagining every disaster, she had never once let herself imagine that it would hurt the most to see him kind. Chapter 3. They stayed. There was never really a choice about it. The king did not command it, which somehow made it worse, because it left her nowhere to put her anger. He simply had rooms prepared and sent for a tutor, and had the keep's kitchens learn what a 6-year-old would and would not eat. And he did all of it quietly, as if he were afraid that any loud movement would make his son disappear. And Bram, who had spent his whole small life reaching toward things he could not name, bloomed in that gray keep like a plant finally turned toward the sun. He followed the king everywhere. He sat at the edge of the training yard and watched the warriors and shouted advice. He fell asleep in the great hall during long, boring council meetings, and no one moved him. He asked the king 1,000 questions a day, and the king, who governed a whole people and had not slept properly in years, answered every single one. Nerys watched it all, with her arms crossed and her heart at war with itself. Because here was the thing she could not say aloud. She had spent 6 years believing that this man had let his own child be sentenced to death. That was the shape of the wound she carried. That was the thing that had driven her down the mountain in the dark. And now she stood in his house, watching him weep with joy over that same child, watching him carry the boy asleep on his shoulder up a flight of stairs, watching a whole pack of wolves soften and murmur and go warm at the sight of their grieving king made whole. And none of it fit. None of it fit the story she had lived by. She caught herself thinking, more than once, that a man who had agreed to have his son killed did not look at that son like this. She made herself stop thinking it, because if the story she had lived by was wrong, then she had stolen 6 years from all 3 of them for nothing, and that was a thing she was not yet strong enough to hold. On the 4th night, old Meryn found her in the still room. Nerys had gone there without deciding to. Her feet had simply carried her down the familiar stairs to the one room in this whole keep that had ever felt like hers, and she had lit the lamp and started sorting the herbs out of habit. And there she was when the door creaked, and a small, bent woman with sharp eyes and a face like a walnut came in and stopped dead. "Well," said Meryn, "so the mountain gives back what it takes after all." Meryn. Nerys's voice cracked on the name. The old woman had been the closest thing to a mother she had known in this place. Meryn crossed the room and took Nerys's face in her 2 dry hands and looked at her for a long time. "I grieved you," she said at last, plainly. "We were told you drowned crossing the river in the spring melt. Half the keep looked for your body. The king near tore himself apart." Her eyes were bright and hard. "And here you stand with a child who has his father's eyes. So you did not drown, girl, and you did not tell us. I think you had better tell me why." So Nerys told her. She sat on the work table where a king had once let her stitch him back together, and she told the old herb woman everything. She told her about the pregnancy, and the fear, and the night everything changed. She told her about the sealed order she had been shown, an order under the king's own seal, commanding that the low-born woman's child be given to the elders at birth, as the old law required, and about the terrible thing she had been made to understand that meant. She told Meryn how she had crept to the door of the king's private chamber and heard Alaric himself, his voice heavy and defeated, say that he could not stop it, that the pack must come first, that some prices a king simply had to pay. She told her how a kind and sorrowful adviser had found her weeping in the corridor afterward and told her the whole cruel truth of it, that the elders meant to leave the infant on the winter mountain to die, that the king was trapped by the old law and the threat of the pack breaking apart and could not defy it and live, that the only mercy left in the world was for her to vanish before the birth, so the baby could live somewhere far away where no one knew whose blood he carried, and that if the king ever learned the child lived, honor and law would force him to hunt them both to the ends of the earth. "So I ran," Nerys finished, her voice very quiet. "I let him think the baby died. I let him think I left him. I thought I was saving my son's life. I thought I was saving Alaric from a war that would kill him. I have believed that every single day for 6 years." She looked up and she saw that all the color had gone out of old Meryn's face. "Girl," Meryn whispered, "there is no such law." The lamp flame guttered. Somewhere far off in the keep a door closed. "There has never been such a law," Meryn said, and now her old voice was shaking with a slow and terrible anger. "Not in my lifetime, nor my mother's. The elders have never taken a living child from an alpha. And that king, that boy, would have burned this whole mountain to the ground before he let anyone touch a hair on a child of his. Whatever you heard, whatever you were shown, it was a lie. Someone lied to you, Nerys. Someone lied to you so well that it cost you 6 years and cost that man his son. Nera sat very still on the work table and felt the story she had lived by crack straight down the middle. Then who, she said. Her lips had gone numb. Who would do such a thing? And why? And that was the question that changed everything. Chapter 4. She could not sleep after that. She lay awake in the fine, soft bed the king had given her and stared at the ceiling and turned the pieces over and over, and every way she turned them, they cut her. If there was no law, then the sealed order had been forged. If the order had been forged, then the king had never signed it. And if the king had never signed it, then the voice she had heard through his chamber door, defeated and sorrowful, saying that he could not stop it, had either not been his, or had been about something else entirely, twisted by a listener too frightened and too young to question what she was hearing. Someone had built her a lie out of a stolen seal and an overheard fragment and a fear she already carried in her bones. Someone had known exactly which fear to press. Someone had known that a low-born girl who loved a king would believe in her deepest heart that the world would never let her keep him or his child. She rose before dawn and went to find Alaric. He was in the war room, alone, standing over a map of the eastern passes with his hands braced on the table. And when she came in, he straightened at once, and something flickered across his still face before he could stop it, and then his face went carefully blank again. They had not been alone together, truly alone, since she had come back. There had always been Bram between them, or servants, or the smooth and watchful presence of the warden. Now it was only the two of them, and the map, and the cold morning light, and 6 years of silence, and Neris found that all the careful words she had prepared had abandoned her. So she asked the only question that mattered. "Alaric," she said, "when our son was born, was there ever a law that would have taken him from us?" He went very still. She watched the question land on him and confuse him. "A law," he repeated slowly. "Neris, there is no such law. What are you talking about?" "You never agreed to let the elders take our child," she said. It came out barely above a whisper. "You never signed an order. You never said that the pack must come first, that some prices a king has to pay." "I never knew there was a child to take." His voice had gone rough. He came around the table toward her and stopped himself a careful distance away, as if he did not trust himself any closer. "Neris, I was told you lost the babe, early and hard in the night. I was told you were broken by grief and by the way this cold place treated you, and that you could not bear to stay, and that you left before the dawn." His jaw worked. "I was shown a farewell in your own hand. I looked for you for a year. I found a trail that said you had drowned in the spring melt, and another that said you had fled to a rival pack, and I did not know which to believe. And both of them ended the same way, in you being gone." He drew a breath that did not seem to reach the bottom of him. "I have grieved a dead child and a lost mate for 6 years. And you tell me the child lives, and you left to save him from a thing that was never real. So one of us has been lied to, or both of us. And I would very much like to know by whom." Neris looked up at the face she had loved and left and grieved, and she saw that it was as broken and as bewildered as her own, and the last of the story she had lived by fell away into nothing. "Both of us," she said. "Alaric, it was both of us." For a long moment neither of them moved. The whole terrible shape of it hung in the air between them. Two people who had loved each other, torn apart and kept apart by a single hand they could not yet see, each believing for 6 years that the other had chosen to leave. "I would have protected you," Alaric said, very low. It was not an accusation. It sounded almost like a plea. "Whatever the pack said, whatever it cost me. If you had come to me and told me you carried my child, there is nothing in this world or the next that would have made me let anyone harm you. Do you know that? Did you ever know that?" And this was the part she could not answer easily, because the honest answer was the wound underneath the wound. "No," she whispered. "I did not know that. I loved you, and I did not believe I was allowed to keep you. I was a healer's daughter, and you were a king. And every day I waited for the world to take you back. So when a kind voice told me the world had finally come to do exactly that, I believed it. I believed it because I had been afraid of it since the first night you laughed in my still room." Her eyes stung. "That is the thing I have to live with. Not only that I was lied to, that I was already so certain I would lose you that the lie barely had to try." The king closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, and he did not look away from her, and he did not touch her, though she could see in every line of him how badly he wanted to. "Then whoever did this," Alaric said quietly, "knew us both very well, knew exactly where we were weak." His voice hardened, and for the first time she heard the wolf underneath the man, low and dangerous. "And that is a very short list of people, Nerys. A very short and very trusted list." She thought of a smooth voice in the great hall on the first day, offering to take the woman and the child somewhere quiet. She thought of silver at a man's temples, and a face full of kind concern, and the strange sense that she had seen it somewhere before. And this time, the memory came all the way up. The sorrowful advisor who had found her weeping in the corridor 6 years ago. The kind voice that had told her the whole cruel truth about the old law and the Winter Mountain. The gentle hand that had guided her, step by careful step, to the decision to disappear. It had been the king's warden. "Alaric," Nerys said, and her voice had gone cold and clear as river ice. "I know who lied to me. I have known his face all along. I simply did not let myself remember it, because it was easier to hate you than to understand that it was someone we both trusted." The king went utterly still. "Say the name," he said. Chapter 5. She did not say it, not yet. Because Meryn, who had a long memory and a healer's caution, caught her arm in the corridor an hour later and pulled her into an alcove and hissed the wisest thing anyone said to her in that whole gray keep. "If you accuse the warden with nothing but your own memory of a conversation 6 years gone," Meryn whispered, "he will smile and grieve and say the poor girl is confused by the shock of returning, and half the pack will believe him because he has spent 20 years being the most trusted man in this hold. You will have your say, and he will have his answer, and nothing will change, except that he will know you know. And a cornered wolf is the most dangerous kind there is." Her old fingers dug in. "You need proof, girl. Real proof, that a pack can see and touch. Find it first, then speak." So Nerys did what she had always done best. She observed, and she asked quiet questions, and she watched for the pattern that did not fit, and the first pattern that did not fit was the king himself. She had put it down, at first, to grief and to the long strain of ruling. But she was a healer, and healers notice bodies, and the more she watched Alaric, the more certain she became that something was wrong with him that had nothing to do with the heart. He tired too easily for a wolf in his prime. His hands, when he thought no one was looking, had a fine tremor in them. There was a grayness under his skin some mornings, and a slowness to his healing that she saw the day he took a shallow cut in the training yard, and it was still angry and unclosed 2 days later, when a wolf should have knit it whole overnight. "How long has he been unwell?" she asked Meryn, keeping her voice light. The old woman's eyes sharpened. 2 years, near enough. It comes and goes. The physicians call it the weight of the crown. His wolf is fading, they say, from grief. She paused. You do not think it is grief? I think, said Nerys slowly, that grief does not leave a man's blood the color of old ash. I think grief does not stop a wolf from healing a scratch. She met Merrin's eyes. I think someone is poisoning the king. Slowly. So slowly that even the poison looks like sorrow. The word sat in the still room like a live coal, because it fit. It fit the whole terrible shape of it. A man who wanted to ruin the line of the Greyvale would not simply take the king's heir and the king's love. He would take the king himself, slowly, patiently, in a way no one could name, so that when the Alpha finally fell, there would be no strong heir to follow him, and a most trusted advisor perfectly placed to hold the pack together in the chaos and, in the fullness of time, to rule it. And the return of a living son shattered that whole patient plan. A son with the king's own eyes, standing in the great hall for the whole court to see. A son who made the king strong again with hope. A son who was, right now, the single greatest threat to everything the warden had spent years building. Which meant the boy was in danger, now. Nerys's blood ran cold. She thought of Bram, following his tutors and his father through the halls of a keep full of people who might mean him harm, and she nearly ran to snatch him up and flee down the mountain a second time. But she was not the frightened girl she had been 6 years ago. She had raised a child alone. She had set bones and closed wounds and stared down fevers that took stronger souls than hers. She was done running. Instead, she did 3 things. She told Alaric, quietly, in the war room, everything she suspected. And she watched the wolf rise up behind his eyes and go still and deadly with the effort of not tearing the keep apart on the spot. He wanted to. She could see it. And she told him, in the flat, calm voice she used on the worst wounds, that if he moved too soon they would lose their proof and their son, and that he had to trust her to do this her way, the healer's way, careful and certain. And he looked at her for a long moment, and then he did the hardest thing an alpha king can do. He let someone else take the lead. She spoke to Halvard, the captain of the king's own guard, a broad, plain, honest man with no cleverness in him and a heart like a rock. And she set him to watch the boy without seeming to, and to trust no food or drink that came to the child unless it had passed through Merrin's hands or her own. And she began, very quietly, to hunt. She started with the poison, because a poison is a thing that must come from somewhere, and a healer knows the roads it travels. She sat with old Merrin, and they went through every wasting herb they knew, every slow, gray death that could be hidden in wine or bread over years, and they narrowed it down to one. A rare thing, from a rare place, a fungus that grew only in the deep marshes of the Far East and had to be dried and ground and given in doses too small to taste. It did not grow anywhere near the Greyvale. It had to be brought in, which meant that somewhere in the keep, hidden among a trusted man's private things, there had to be a store of it and a means of getting more. And it meant something else, too. Something that made Nerys go very quiet when she realized it. The far eastern marshes lay in the old lands of the Ironwood, a pack that had been broken and scattered in a war 2 generations back, in the reign of Alaric's hard father. She had heard the name once as a girl, spoken like a shadow. She did not yet understand what that meant, but she wrote it down, in her small, careful hand, next to the name of the poison, and she felt the whole thing begin to come together into a single, dreadful line. She was so intent on the pieces that she almost missed the danger when it finally came for her. It came 3 nights later, on the stairs. Chapter 6. She was coming down from Bram's room, late, after sitting with him until he slept, and the tower stair was dark, and she had a candle in one hand. She heard nothing. Wolves do not make noise when they do not wish to. She simply felt, all at once, the wrongness of a body close behind her in the black, and a hand closed on her shoulder and shoved. If she had been anyone else, she would have fallen the whole length of that stone stair and been found in the morning with a broken neck, a poor, grieving woman who lost her footing in the dark, and no one would have asked a single question. But Neris had spent 6 years hauling herself up muddy riverbanks and wrestling frightened patients twice her weight, and her body knew how to fight before her mind did. She dropped the candle and turned into the shove instead of away from it, and got a fistful of a heavy sleeve and hauled with all her weight, and the two of them went down together in a tangle instead of her going down alone. She hit hard. Her shoulder screamed, but she did not break, and she did not stop moving, and she came up onto her knees in the dark with her healer's blade already in her hand, a small, sharp thing she used for opening wounds and had carried on her belt since she was 14 years old. "I know it was you," she said into the dark, and she was surprised to hear how steady her own voice was. "I know what you did to me. I know what you are doing to him. And I am not the frightened girl you sent down this mountain 6 years ago." There was a silence, and then, from the black, came a soft and terrible laugh, and the smooth, kind voice of the king's warden, no longer kind at all. "No," he agreed quietly, "you are not. That was always the risk in letting you live at all. I should have made certain of the river." She heard him shift, heard the whisper of steel. "You were a great deal of trouble, healer, for a little village girl. Do you know, I nearly admired you. It is not easy to make an alpha believe his mate abandoned him. He is a suspicious creature. But you did half the work for me. You already believed the world would take him from you. I only had to hold up the door." "Why?" said Neris. She kept the blade up and her back to the wall and her voice moving, because as long as he was talking, he was not striking, and because some part of her needed to understand. You had his trust. You had his throne in your hand. Why would that not be enough? Why do this? Why any of it? Another silence, and when he spoke again, for the first time, there was something raw under the smoothness, something old and rotted and grieving in its own poisoned way. "Because his father burned my family alive when I was 9 years old," said Corvin, the king's warden, the last-blooded son of the Ironwood. "Because I watched King Roderick's wolves put my whole pack to the sword and the torch, my mother, my sisters, all of it, and I crawled out of the ashes, and I made myself into exactly the sort of loyal, useful, trusted thing that men like that keep close. It took me 20 years to get my hand on the heart of the Greyvale." His voice shook and steadied. "I do not want the throne, girl. I want the line ended. I want Roderick's blood to die out slow and childless and grieving, the way he made mine die fast and screaming. I took the king's love. I took his air. I have been feeding him his own death by the spoonful for 2 years. He was so close to the end." And now the rot in his voice turned hard and clear. "And then you walked back through my doors with a boy who has his eyes, and undid all of it. So the boy dies, and you die, and the king breaks one last time and follows them both into the dark. And I will have my ending after all." Neris understood then that she was going to have to do this herself. There was no guard coming. There was no king riding to the rescue. There was only her, on a black stair, with a small blade and a monster who had spent his whole life learning to wear a kind face. So she did the thing a healer does. She reached, in the dark, for the one weapon she always carried, and no one ever thought to fear. Her satchel was still on her hip. Her fingers found the small twist of oilcloth by touch, the one she kept for cleaning deep wounds, packed tight with dried and powdered devil's pepper, a thing so fierce it could blind a man for an hour and burn like fire in the eyes and throat. "You are right about one thing, Warden," Nerys said, and let her voice shake on purpose. Let it go small and frightened, the way he expected a village girl's voice to go. "I am only a healer." She heard him move in for the kill, confident, unhurried, and she threw the whole twist of pepper straight into the sound of his face. The warden screamed. It was not a smooth sound at all. He clawed at his eyes and staggered back and lost the stare, and Nerys did not wait to see him fall. She was already up and running, down and down the black steps she knew by heart, shouting with every breath, waking the whole tower, calling for Halvard and for the king and for anyone who could hear, her voice ringing off the cold stone. "The warden!" she screamed. "It is the warden! Wake the king! It has always been the warden!" Doors began to bang open above and below her. Lights bloomed. Somewhere close, a great voice she knew answered her. An alpha's roar that shook dust from the beams, and boots were pounding toward her in the dark. But even as the keep woke around her, even as the trap she had sprung began to close, one cold thought cut through everything else and turned her blood to ice. The warden had said, "The boy dies." And the warden had not come to those stairs alone. Chapter 7. She never remembered running to Bram's room. She only remembered arriving. The door stood open. It should not have. She had closed it herself. She flung herself through it with her heart in her mouth, and the sight that met her stopped her cold on the threshold. Bram was sitting up in his bed, wide awake, his gray eyes huge in the candlelight. And between him and the window stood Halvard, the captain of the guard, broad and steady as a wall, with his sword out and his back to the boy, and a body already crumpled at his feet. A man in dark clothes, one of the wardens, sent to do quietly in the night what his master could not. "I have him, my lady," Halvard said, without turning, his voice as calm as if he were reporting the weather. "You said trust no one near the boy, so I did not. This one came up the servant's stair an hour past. He will not be troubling the young prince again." Nerys crossed the room in 3 steps and gathered her son up and held him so hard he squeaked, and she felt his small heart beating fast and whole against her chest, and for a moment she could not speak at all. "You are all right," she managed. "You are all right." "There was a man," Bram said into her shoulder, matter of fact and only a little frightened. Halvard was faster. He pulled back and looked at her with his father's eyes. "Where is my father? Is my father all right?" His wolf went very loud again. I felt it all through the floor. And that, Nerys realized, was the last piece of the trap she had not accounted for. Because the warden, cornered and blinded and undone, was a man with nothing left to lose. He had spent 2 years feeding the king a slow, gray death. If he thought his ending was slipping away from him, there was one last thing he could do to make certain the line of Roderick died with him. He could finish the poison all at once. "Halvard," Nerys said, and her voice was iron. "Bring the boy. Bring warriors. We go to the king. Now. Run." They ran. The great hall was in chaos when they reached it, lit by 100 hasty torches, filling with warriors and elders and frightened servants, a whole pack roused in the dead of night and not yet understanding why. And at the center of it all, on the steps of his own dais, stood King Alaric, swaying, one hand pressed to his chest, his face the color of ash. And standing before him with a cup in his hand and blood streaming from his ruined eyes, stood the warden, holding out that cup like a gift. "Drink, my king," Corvin was saying, and even blinded and screaming inside, his voice had found its old smoothness again, It's old poison. You are unwell. The shock of the night. Here is your medicine. You have taken it from my hand for 2 years. Take it now. Let me care for you, as I always have." And the king, gray and swaying, and half out of his mind with the sudden violence of whatever the warden had already slipped him, reached for the cup out of 2 years of trained and trusting habit. "Stop!" Neris shouted, and the whole hall turned. She came down the center of that great hall with her son's hand in hers and her healer's satchel on her hip, and 100 wolves watching. And she did not stop until she stood between the king and the warden, and she struck the cup out of Corvin's hand so that it flew across the floor and shattered against the stone, and the dark thing inside it spread across the pale flagstones like a stain. "That is not medicine," Neris said, and she pitched her voice to carry to the farthest corner of the hall, clear and ringing and certain. "That is death. That has always been death. This man has been poisoning your king for 2 years. This man forged an order under the king's seal 6 years ago to drive me from this keep. This man took your alpha's mate and his son and his health, one careful piece at a time, and he is not who you think he is at all." She turned to face the whole assembled pack, and she pointed at the blinded, bleeding man beside her. "His name is not Corvin. He is the last son of the Ironwood, and he has spent his whole life among you, wearing a loyal face, waiting to watch your king's line die. Do not take my word for it. His own things will tell you. Search his chambers. You will find the poison. You will find the far eastern marsh fungus that grows only in the old Ironwood lands. You will find everything." For one heartbeat, the great hall hung in perfect silence. And then the warden, blinded and cornered and stripped of every mask he had ever worn, gave up the last of his pretending, and he lunged for the king with a blade pulled from his own sleeve, one last strike to finish the work of 20 years. But Neris was already moving. She had been watching his hands the whole time, the way she watched a fevered patient for the moment they would thrash. And she had known, in her healer's certainty, that a cornered thing always strikes at last. She stepped into him instead of away, exactly as she had on the stairs, and she caught his knife arm at the wrist with both hands and turned all her weight against the joint the way she had set 100 broken limbs, and she felt the blade come loose and clatter to the stone. And then Halvard was there, and the king's warriors were there, a dozen wolves who had loved their king and been deceived alongside him. And they took the last son of the Ironwood down onto the flagstones of the Grey Vale and held him fast. And it was over. The hall erupted. But Neris did not hear it. She had already turned from the fallen warden, already dropped to her knees beside the swaying king, already had her satchel open, and her hands on his face and her voice in his ear. "Alaric, Alaric, look at me. How much did he give you tonight? How much?" "A cup," the king said thickly. His gray eyes struggled to find hers. "Before you came," he said, "it would steady me." A terrible understanding moved through his fading face. "It was never meant to steady me." No. Neris was already working, already pulling the small, dark bottle from her bag, the thing she and Marin had prepared 3 nights ago in the still room against exactly this hour. Because a healer who suspects a poison does not wait to be sure before she brews the cure. She got the king's head back and the bottle to his lips. "Drink this, all of it. Trust me. You told me on our first night that a king who lets himself die of stubbornness is no use to anyone." Her voice broke and steadied. "Do not make a liar of yourself now. Drink." And the Alpha King of the Grey Vale, the most powerful wolf in the mountains, laid his life in the hands of a healer for the second time, and drank. Chapter 8. He did not die. For a long and terrible night, it was not certain. The poison the warden had built to work slowly over years, forced all at once into a body already worn thin by it, fought hard against the cure, and Nerys fought harder. She did not leave his side. She sat on the edge of his great bed as she had once sat on the edge of a work table, and she poured her draughts into him and cooled his fever and held his shaking hands, and somewhere in the black middle of the night, when his breathing thinned and even Meryn went quiet, Nerys leaned close to his ear and said the thing she had not let herself say in 6 years. "You do not get to leave me," she whispered fiercely. "I left you once because I was too afraid to believe I could keep you. I am not afraid anymore. So you do not get to leave. Do you hear me? Our son is asleep down the hall, and he has waited his whole life to know you, and you do not get to leave him. Fight. Fight the way you fought that rock slide. Fight the way you made me fall in love with you, you stubborn, impossible king. Fight." And near dawn his fever broke, and his color came back, slow as sunrise, and his breathing steadied and deepened and turned at last into sleep, real sleep, the first easy sleep his body had known in 2 poisoned years. Nerys put her head down on the edge of his bed and wept, quietly, from sheer exhaustion and relief, and did not notice when she fell asleep too. She woke to the feeling of a hand in her hair. Gray morning light filled the room. The king was awake, propped against his pillows, weak and hollow-eyed and alive, and he was looking down at her with an expression she had no armor left against. His hand moved gently through her hair, as if he were afraid she would vanish if he stopped. "You saved my life," Alaric said, his voice a ruin. "Again. And you saved our son. And you gave me back my whole world in a single night, after I spent 6 years believing I had lost it forever." His hand stilled against her cheek. "Nerys, I do not have the words. I am a king, and I have spoken to armies, and I do not have the words for what you have done." She sat up slowly. Her whole body ached. Her heart ached worse. "You do not owe me words," she said. "You do not owe me anything, Alaric. That is what I need you to understand." She made herself look at him. "I took your son. I know I was lied to. I know the fault was the warden's. But it was my arms that carried Bram down that mountain, and my choice that kept him from you for 6 years. And every day you grieved was a day I could have ended and did not. So if there is a debt in this room, it is mine. And I will spend my whole life trying to pay it. You do not owe me a single thing." For a long moment the king was quiet, and then he did something she did not expect. Weak as he was, he pushed himself up off his pillows, and he took her face in both his hands, and he made her look at him. "Listen to me," he said, low and fierce. "You were a girl of 19, carrying a child, alone in a cold place that had never once made you feel safe. And the most trusted man in the kingdom looked you in the eye and swore your baby would be killed, and showed you my own seal to prove it. You made the only choice a mother could make with the truth you were given. You did not fail me, Nerys. You were failed. We were both failed, by the same hand, and I will not sit here and let you carry his crime as your guilt for one more day." His thumbs moved across her cheekbones. "The only debt in this room is mine, because I let you believe, for a single moment of our whole life together, that I was a king first and yours second. I let you doubt that I would burn the world for you. And a woman who doubts that will believe anyone who tells her the world has come to take her love away." His eyes were wet. "So no, you do not owe me. I owe you, and I am going to spend the rest of my life proving to you what I should have made you believe from the very first night. That there is nothing, Nerys, nothing in this world or beyond it, that would ever make me let you go." And then the Alpha King of the Greyvale, weak and gray and barely returned from death, kissed the healer who had saved him. And it was not a beginning, and it was not an ending. It was 6 years of grief and silence and lies, finally setting down its weight and coming home. There was a small cough from the doorway. They broke apart. Bram stood there in his nightshirt, watching them with the deeply satisfied expression of a child whose plan has come together exactly as he intended. "Good," said Bram firmly. "You are supposed to do that. You are my mother and my father." He padded across the room and climbed up onto the great bed and wedged himself neatly between the two of them, as if he had been doing it every morning of his life. Now nobody is sad anymore. Nerys looked at her son, and at the man she had loved and lost and found again, and at the gray morning light filling a room that had been full of death only hours before. And she thought that of all the truths she had learned in that cold keep, this was the one worth everything the others had cost. Nobody was sad anymore. Chapter 9. The reckoning came, as reckonings do, in the great hall, before the whole pack. They brought the warden out in chains, his ruined eyes bound, his kind face finally and utterly gone. And the elders searched his chambers, exactly as Nerys had told them to, and they found it all. The store of dried marsh fungus, the small measures for the poison, the forged seal matrix, cut in secret, that had stamped a false order 6 years ago and driven a frightened girl down a mountain in the dark, and, hidden beneath a loose stone, a bundle of letters in a hand no one in the Greyvale could read, addressed to the scattered remnants of a broken pack, promising them a day of reckoning that would never now come. There was no doubt left for anyone to hide behind. The proof was there for the whole pack to see and touch, real and undeniable, the way old Meryn had said it must be. And so no one could call it the confusion of a returning woman, or the grief of a wronged king. They could only look at the evidence of 20 years of patient hatred, and understand at last what had been living among them wearing a loyal face. King Alaric sat his throne to pass judgment, still weak but growing stronger by the day, and Nerys stood at his side, and Bram sat on the steps of the dais with the solemn importance of a young prince, and the whole assembled pack watched their king decide the fate of the man who had tried to end his line. Alaric did not roar. He did not rage. When at last he spoke, his voice was quiet and heavy, and it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "You watched my father destroy your people," the king said to the chained man. "I will not pretend that was not a great and terrible wrong. If you had come to me as a young man and laid that grief at my feet, I would have heard you. I would have tried to make what amends a son can make for a father's sins. There might have been a road, Ironwood, between your people and mine, if you had wanted one." His jaw tightened. "But you did not want amends. You did not want your people restored. You wanted only a slow and grieving death for mine. You poisoned me for 2 years. You sent a man in the night to murder a child asleep in his bed. You stole 6 years from a woman and a son and a father, not for justice, but for the pleasure of watching us grieve." The king rose to his feet, and the whole pack rose with the terrible weight of his voice. "That is not the reckoning of a wronged son. That is the work of a monster who chose to become the very thing that unmade him. And the Greyvale does not suffer a poisoner of children to live. By the ancient law of the pack, the true and living law that had nothing at all to do with the one the warden had once invented, the last son of the Ironwood was condemned for treason, for the poisoning of an alpha, and for the attempted murder of a child of the blood. The sentence was death, and it was carried out, and if there was any small mercy in it, it was only that the pack did not make it slow, whatever slowness he had earned. The line of hatred that had begun in a burning pack 2 generations gone ended, at last, on the cold flagstones of the hall it had spent 20 years trying to destroy. And when it was done, King Alaric turned to his people, and he did the thing that Nerys would remember longest of all. He took his son by the hand, and he took the healer by the hand, and he brought them both to the very edge of the dais, before the whole watching pack. And he did not lower his voice, and he did not soften it, and he did not check first to see who might object. "Hear me," the Alpha King said. "This is Nerys, of the village of Thornwell. 6 years ago I loved her, and I was too much a coward and too much a king to shout it from this dais where it belonged, and a wicked man used my silence to tear her from me. I will not make that mistake twice." He lifted her hand in his. "She is not a healer I favor. She is not a low-born girl the pack must learn to tolerate. She is the woman I have loved since the first night she scolded a king for bleeding on her work table. And she is the mother of my heir, and she will be my mate and your queen. And any wolf in this vale who has a word to say against it may come and say it to me now, to my face, in the light." The hall was utterly silent, and then, from among the elders, an old gray wolf of a man stepped forward, and Nerys braced herself, because here at last, she thought, was the objection she had feared her whole life, the pack rising up to take him back after all. But the old elder only went slowly and stiffly down onto one knee, and bowed his gray head, and said in a voice cracked with age and something that might have been shame, "My king, we failed to protect this woman once, when she was young and alone and frightened among us. We will not fail her again." He lifted his head. "The gray veil welcomes its queen and its prince." And one by one, all through that great hall, the wolves of the gray veil went down onto their knees, elders and warriors and servants alike, a whole pack kneeling, not to a law and not to a lie, but to a woman who had walked back up a mountain she had sworn never to see again, and saved their king, and refused to run. Nerys stood at the edge of the dais, with her son's hand in one of hers, and her king's hand in the other, and she looked out over a sea of bowed heads, and she thought of the frightened girl who had crept down this same mountain in the dark 6 years ago, certain that the world would never let her keep any of this. The world had tried, she thought. The world had sent its cruelest lie to take it all away, and she had come back and taken it home. Chapter 10. They were not married in haste. Nerys would not have it, and neither, once he understood her, would Alaric. Because here was the thing she made him see, in the quiet weeks that followed, in the still room where it had all begun, with the herbs drying overhead and the lamp low between them. She would not be won back on gratitude. She would not have him marry her because she had saved his life, any more than she would have married him 6 years ago out of duty or debt. If they did this, she told him, they would do it right this time. Slowly, in the light, with the whole truth between them and nothing hidden. So the Alpha King of the Grey Vale courted the healer he was already going to marry, and it was, Meryn said tartly, the most ridiculous thing she had seen in 60 years. And also, she admitted more quietly, one of the sweetest. He came to the still room in the evenings, as he had when they were young, and this time he did not pretend to have a wound. He simply came and sat on her work table, and they talked. About the 6 lost years. About the boy they had each half raised alone, in their different ways, and how they would raise the rest of him together. About the fear she had carried since she was a girl, that she was not enough for a king, and how he meant to spend the rest of his life proving it wrong. Not with grand words before the pack, though there had been one of those, but in the small, daily way of a man who chooses the same person every single morning. He learned the whole of her son, every strange and wonderful thing about the boy who talked to wolves. And Bram, who had spent his whole small life reaching toward a father he could not name, spent that autumn wrapped in one, learning to ride, learning the names of the mountains, falling asleep against the king's chest in the great hall during long council meetings, while the whole pack pretended not to notice their fearsome alpha going soft and still so as not to wake his son. And one night, when the first snow of the year came whispering down past the tower windows, the same snow she had once fled through in the dark, Nerys went to the king's chambers on no errand at all, and he opened the door and looked at her and did not say a word. And she came in and closed it behind her. "I am not afraid any more," she told him quietly. "I want you to know that. When I came back up this mountain, I told myself it was only for Bram, that I would never let you close again, because the last time I did, it cost me everything." She stepped into him. "That was the last lie I let myself believe, and I am done with it." She lifted her face to his. "I love you, Alaric. I loved you when I ran. I loved you every day I raised your son beside a river, telling him his father was a great man. And I am not going to spend one more night afraid to say it." The king gathered her in, careful and reverent, the way he did everything that mattered to him, as if she were the one thing in the world worth being gentle for. "Then say it again," he murmured against her hair. "I waited 6 years to hear it. Say it until neither of us can remember what afraid felt like." She did, and the first snow fell soft and silent past the tower windows, and the fire burned low, and the rest of that night belonged only to the two of them, and to the 6 years they were finally, gently, done grieving. Chapter 11. They were wed in the spring, when the mountain passes opened and the whole Greyvale turned green. It was not a small thing. A pack that has watched its king grieve for 6 years does not let him marry quietly, and neither would Nerys have wanted it hidden this time, when the whole point was that nothing between them would ever be hidden again. So they were married before the entire pack, under the open sky, with the mountains standing witness, and old Meryn wept the whole way through it, and pretended she had something in her eye. Halvard, who had stood between a killer and a sleeping child without being told twice, stood beside the king as his sworn shield, and there was no man in the Vale who had earned the place more. And Bram walked his mother to his father, 6 years old and solemn as a judge, because he had informed the entire keep that this was the proper way of it, and no one had the heart to tell him otherwise. The villain's name was not spoken at the wedding, but it was not hidden either in the days after, because Nerys had learned what silence could be made to do, and she would not build her happiness on any more of it. The truth of the warden was told plainly to the whole pack, all of it. The burning of the ironwood 2 generations gone, the boy who crawled out of the ashes, the 20 years of patient hatred, the poison and the forged seal, and the man sent in the night. It was written into the pack's own long memory, not as a shame to be buried, but as a warning to be remembered. That a wrong left to rot becomes a monster. That the cruelest lies are the ones that press on a fear we already carry. And that the surest way to lose everything is to be so certain the world will take it that you hand it over yourself. The ironwood remnants, when they were found, were not put to the sword. Alaric, who had watched what his father's cruelty had grown into, would not plant that seed again. The scattered survivors of the broken pack were offered a hard and honest peace instead, land in the eastern reaches, and a place under the Greyvale's protection. And most of them, weary of a grief they had carried for 2 generations, took it. It was not a thing that healed in a season, but it was a road. The road the warden might have walked and would not. And it was open now, and that was more than there had been before. Alaric's health came back slowly, and then, all at once. By the height of summer, the grayness was gone from his skin, and the tremor gone from his hands, and his wolf, which the physicians had mourned as fading, ran strong and whole through the high meadows again, with a chestnut-haired boy on his back shrieking with joy. What the pack had grieved as the natural fading of an alpha spirit turned out to have been a poison all along. And once the poison was gone, so was the fading, and the gray veil had its king back in full, stronger than he had been in years, because he finally had something worth being strong for. And Neris, who had come up the mountain as a fugitive and a stranger, became a queen the way she did everything, quietly and without any fuss, by simply being useful and steady and kind until no one could imagine the place without her. She kept the still room. She would not give it up, crown or no crown, and the sick and the hurt of the Grey Vale learned that their queen would set a broken arm as readily as she would sit a throne, and they loved her for it in the deep and lasting way a people love someone who does not think herself above them. She never did learn to stop watching Bram wander toward tree lines and running water, but she stopped being afraid of it, because the pull that had once carried him away from her, up a mountain road and into a court full of strangers, had never been a danger at all. It had been his own blood calling him home, to a father he had never met, and a truth she had kept from him with the best and most terrible of intentions. The pull had known what she had been too frightened to believe, that home was real, that it was waiting, and that all it had ever needed was for one small, stubborn, wolf-hearted boy to let go of his mother's hand and walk through the door. Epilogue. 2 years later, on a soft gray morning much like the one on which it had all begun, Neris sat in the window of the still room with a new weight in her arms and watched the courtyard below. The weight was small and warm and sleeping. A daughter this time, 3 weeks old, with her father's dark hair and, the midwife swore, the beginnings of her mother's stubborn chin. They had not decided her name yet. Alaric wanted to name her for his mother. Neris wanted to wait until they knew who she was. They would argue about it happily for another month, she suspected, and it would be one of the good arguments, the kind you have when you are certain of the person across from you. Down in the courtyard, the king of the Grey Vale was losing a wooden sword fight to his son. He was losing it badly, and on purpose, staggering back under the ferocious assault of an 8-year-old prince who had lately decided he would be the greatest warrior in the mountains, and the whole training yard had stopped to watch their fearsome alpha reel and clutch his chest and topple slowly into the dust, while Bram stood over him in triumph. Halvard, watching from the wall, had given up all pretense of dignity and was laughing openly. Neris smiled down at them, her husband and her son, in the sunlight, in the safe green heart of a kingdom that had once nearly been destroyed by an old man's hidden grief. And she thought about how close she had come to never seeing any of it. She thought about the frightened girl on the mountain road in the dark, so certain she was doing the only right thing, so certain the world would never let her keep this. She wished, sometimes, that she could go back and find that girl and take her by the shoulders and tell her the truth. That it was a lie. That the kind voice in the corridor was a monster. That she was allowed to fight for the man she loved. That she was allowed to believe she was enough. That home was real and waiting and worth walking back up a whole mountain for. But she could not go back. And in the end, she thought, it did not matter. Because that frightened girl had done the one thing that made all the rest of it possible anyway. She had kept the baby safe. Whatever else the lie had cost them, and it had cost them dearly, her son had lived and grown, and one gray morning let go of her hand and walked home and set the whole crooked story straight. Down in the courtyard, the fallen king climbed to his feet and scooped his laughing son up over one shoulder and looked up at the tower window as if he had felt her watching, which, being a wolf, he probably had. He lifted one hand to her. She lifted the baby's tiny hand and waved it back at him, and Bram, upside down over his father's shoulder, shrieked something joyful that she could not hear but did not need to. Nobody is sad anymore, she thought. and she gathered her sleeping daughter closer and watched her family in the sunlight and let herself be, at long last, completely and simply happy. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Here's what I want to know from you. She carried the truth alone for 6 years, believing she was protecting her son, and it cost the man she loved everything he had. So tell me honestly, do you think you could ever forgive her the way Alaric did? Or is 6 years of a stolen child something love should not have to forgive? You cannot say both. Let me know in the comments. I read every one. If you would like more stories, there are plenty more on the channel. Much love, Sophie.